13 Tales Told by a Dubliner by Conmee. Story number 3. People at the bottom of the garden. In the year 1961, Frank Conmee bought a house in the suburb of Terenure on the south side of Dublin. There were old houses of red brick that had been built in the interwar years. They all had long gardens front and back. At the back you could see the neighbours' gardens, all with low stone walls, and the backs of the houses stretching away down to Kimmage. The queer thing was that at the bottom of the garden there was an empty plot of land. It was all overgrown with long grass. There was an entrance to it up the road, but nobody ever went in there. The next door neighbours explained to Frank that it was left over from the building of the houses years ago. A market gardener used to use it for growing vegetables, but then he died, and since then it was unused. Mrs. Conmee, née Craig, loved the house. It was red brick. Once she had lived in a brick-fronted house on Garville Avenue in Rathgar, and always wanted to get back to the south side of town. That's why she gave Frank no peace till they moved there from Finglas. Frank and the family got used to sitting out in the back garden on fine days during the summer, and there was no one to look at them or disturb them, since there was nothing over the back wall but this piece of empty land lying fallow. And they used to hear a blackbird singing melodiously from the top of a clump of yew trees down there. The next summer after that was a long and warm summer, and they were out sitting in the back again. Frank would mow the lawn, and the kids would help him, and they would drop the mown grass and other garden rubbish in a pile on the other side of the wall at the bottom of the garden. Sometimes the kids would climb over the wall and explore the empty land, but he discouraged them. They had a sleek black dog. He used to jump over the wall when he could and seemed to get lost amid the long grass, and they'd have to call him back. One evening, Frank was finishing up his work in the garden and was standing emptying the pile of grass he'd raked up onto the rubbish pile. He looked up, and a woman was looking at him across the wall, very still. She was young and very fetching. They looked at one another, and then she smiled. He smiled back. She was picking flowers, and as she picked them, she sang what seemed an unearthly song. Je suis d'Irlande, de la sainte terre d'Irlande. Je vous en prie, monsieur, venez par sainte charité, danser avec moi en Irlande. The song filled the whole lazy summer's afternoon, and as he stood there, he felt it drawing him in like a spell. At first he'd heard nothing, but bit by bit he began to hear the words and understand them too. And when she stopped near him and began to speak, he understood what she was saying and replied in the same language. So they got to talking. She was dressed in a strange old-fashioned way. First he thought she might be a nun, but her dress was too rich for that. She told him she lived there. He said he was surprised, for he didn't know that anybody lived there. Oh yes, she said, they all lived in the castle. Who did? Herself and her father and brothers. Her father was Milo Le Bret, and she was Alice Le Bret. Did he live over the wall from them then? Yes, obviously he did. Would he see her again? Yes, he would, soon, he said, not knowing half of what he was saying. Now every time he went down to the bottom of the garden, she was there. Alice Le Bret. She was in her 20s, he judged. Her hair was strawberry blonde, her eyes were grey, and she smiled at him. No woman had smiled at him for years, he thought. They talked for longer and longer. He hadn't much to tell her. Maybe about his apple tree, just overlooking the wall, and the scant fruit it gave, and his flowers that he watered. It didn't seem to matter much. She talked casually about horses and hounds, and her father and mother, and her 2 younger brothers, and about music and dancing in the hall at the castle. He told her he lived for the times he could see her. It was true. She looked up the lawn on his side to the house and the kitchen door. You have a wife, she said, frowning. It doesn't matter, he replied. You are what matters to me now. Alice sometimes came riding up on her horse, a dark brown animal with an embroidered saddle. She was dressed like a huntsman, in a green hat with a feather, her hair tucked up inside it, a green tunic, green trousers and leather buskins, and she again looked very fetching in a boyish way. Other times during the summer she wore a long white dress and a head covering of the same material. One day, when Frank came upon her having climbed over the wall, she sat in a bower and read a book. What was the book? Perhaps a book of poems or a book of hours, he wondered. Frank was fond of reading, though he had never read a French or a Latin book. What are you reading, me lady? He asked. She showed him. It was a small book for carrying about with one, handwritten in a Gothic script. He took the leather-bound book in his hand and looked at it, puzzled. It is the Lays of Marie de France, from our home country, she said. These books come into the port of Dublin in plenty now. He looked at her earnestly and then smiled. Tell me about the story you're reading. He sat down in the leafy bower with her. We come from Brittany, she explained, from Saint-Malo. It is a city by the sea. Marie de France used to live there. She heard a Breton story from the old Breton storytellers in their old language, and she has made it into a lay. She tells the story of a nightingale. But there are no nightingales here, only blackbirds, yet they sing so prettily. She smiled and pointed up into the yew trees. Then she looked at the book again. She read, En Saint-Malo, en la contrée, est une ville renommée. 2 chevaliers y manaient, et 2 fortes maisons y avaient. She put the book down in her lap. A woman is married but has a lover, she explained. It is another knight who lives in the next house in the town of Saint-Malo. She goes to the window to talk to him every day. Her old husband gets suspicious and asks her about this. She tells him she is listening to the nightingale that nests nearby. It sings so beautifully. So the old knight goes out into the garden and kills the poor bird. He picks up the body, he brings it to his wife and throws it in front of her. She gathers it up and sends it to her lover. He says he will keep it preserved in memory of their love till the day he dies. She looked up from her book with longing eyes. A good story, said Frank. Yes, she said quietly. When you hear the blackbird singing, you can think of this story of mine. Whenever the family sat out in the back that long summer, he would look down across the wall and see her. He saw other people too. There were men, some on horseback, some on foot, some in green tunics, some in suits of mail. He said nothing to his wife or the kids, and they seemed to notice nothing of this. He would find some excuse to go down to the back wall. She would come to the back wall on her side. They would talk in an undertone. They were standing between Frank's family in their garden and the men-at-arms in theirs, but neither group seemed to notice them. He realised dimly that it was because he stayed on his side of the wall and she stayed on hers. No one except them could see who or what was really on the other side of that back wall. When autumn and winter came, he used to spend time out there, talking to his lady-love, for such she was now, over the wall. The wife and kids thought little of it. He was just out in the garden for a spell. Sometimes he'd get over the wall and go and meet her in the long grass and bushes on the plot of land. He'd be gone for hours. When he went over the wall, he was in her world. When he stayed on his own side, he was in his world. The wife and kids just thought he liked to spend time out in the garden, working on the plants or in the shed. And when he crossed the wall and disappeared in the long grass, he wanted to be by himself. He could be away in the other world for as long as he liked, he realised. When he was away, time in his own world stood still. When he was in there, what did he see? He saw the wild grass extend into a bed of sedge and reeds around a pond where some trees grew. The pond was fed by the Poddle, a little river that flowed down through Kimmage. In the distance was the stone castle of the Le Bret family. Alice and himself went for walks around the pond. They sat together in the arbour, and she would read to him from her book. Eventually, though, the brothers, two very young men as they seemed to be, could see him, because he was on their side of the wall now, and they got upset about her talking to this stranger. They came when they were sitting in the arbour. Frank and the new arrivals looked at each other, frowning, but Alice made light of the whole thing. She put down her book and said to him with a smile, "These are my brothers, Jean and Richard. Brothers, this gentleman is Francois, who lives nearby." They still frowned as before. "Alice," said one of them, "it is not seemly that you spend your time out here with this stranger." Then he turned to Frank. "Stranger, do not come near the castle like this. It is not seemly. We do not know what manner of man you are." Frank looked from one to the other. The second brother said to him, "It is so. Leave our sister be. And you, monsieur, be gone from here, if you value your life." "Sure I can't be gone," says Frank. "I live here." The two looked perplexed. Alice just burst into peals of laughter. "It is so," she told them. "It is just as Francois says. He lives just over that wall, where you cannot see him. But I can. He and his family live in a house in a small garden there, with an apple tree. It's just like the houses in Saint-Malo. They're all close together." Jean and Richard just stood there and continued to frown. Frank got up. "Well, Alice," he said, "I must work in my garden. You can talk with your brothers. Maybe you can read them a story from your book." He beat a dignified retreat as best he could. As he disappeared among the long grass and bushes and reached the back wall, he could hear voices raised and more peals of laughter. He would have to be careful, he knew. If the argument continued this evening in the castle, perhaps Milo Le Bret would be thinking to himself and wondering which of his tenants this Francois might be. A few days later, He was in fact working in his garden when he heard a horse's hooves coming through the long grass. Then he saw it was Alice, riding a dark brown horse as she often did. She was attired in her huntsman's attire, with her leather buskins in the stirrups and the feather in her cap, nodding gaily as she rode along. Seeing him, she swung out of the saddle gracefully and landed on the grass. Then she led her horse by the bridle over to the wall. They smiled at one another and said nothing for a while. "Maybe it's best if I stay on my own side of the wall," said Frank ruefully. "I don't mean to provoke your brothers, or even less so your father, Milo Le Bret, in his castle." "Well, yes," she said with a graceful shrug. "If my two young brothers do not see you, they will forget about you. They have other things to be interested in, such as horses and hounds, and their demoiselles that they want to be courting." She threw back her head and laughed her musical laugh. Then she went on, "As for me father, he hasn't time for such things. He's very busy. With his lands and his tenants and his standing in Dublin, I suppose." "Yes, that and more besides," said Alice. "But here, I shall come over the wall to you, and we can sit under your apple tree. It is as good a place as the bower on my side." Frank looked over his shoulder apprehensively, but the wife and kids were not there. And before he could say anything, Alice had grasped the top of the wall with her kid-gloved hands and cleared it with a graceful leap. They went and sat under the shade of the apple tree, which had a canopy of leaves. They leaned against the trunk of the tree as they sat together. "What is your father so busy about then?" Frank asked after a while. "Why, there is talk of a crusade," said Alice. "He had visitors from Dublin who were talking about it. Now he has to go to meetings about it in Dublin Castle. The Turks have taken over the city of Jerusalem and the whole land of Palestine that Christians not so long ago held. The pilgrims cannot go there now to see the holy places. So the kings of Christendom, the King of England and Normandy, the King of France, the Emperor, and the Pope in Rome have decreed that there must be a new crusade so that we can wrest back control of Jerusalem." "But let us talk of other things," she said with a sigh. She looked up the lawn to the back of Frank's house, considering the kitchen door, the windows on 2 stories, and the corrugated tiles in the roof. "What strange houses you have here," she said, "though it is like a street in Saint-Malo, I suppose. You could sit at the window up there and look out in the evenings and hear the nightingale, no, the blackbird, singing in the yew tree over the wall. Do you ever do that?" Frank smiled and shook his head. "No," he said. "When I come home from a day's work, I feel tired, and with the family there, I always have other things to do. I would have no time to listen to birds singing." "I would," she said. "I like you that way," he said. She looked up into the tree above them. "You have good apples there," she said. "I think some of them are ripe." "Pick one," he said. She did. Then she sat down beside him, and her dainty white teeth took a bite out of it. Then she handed it to him. They shared it. Soon it was gone. She looked at the evening sky and got up to go. "Good apples," she murmured. "Take one with you," Frank said. She smiled. "In the castle gardens we have several apple trees, and the fruit must be ripening there too. But I'm glad to take one of yours. It'll remind me of you on the other side. I look at it and say, this one came from Francois's tree." She vaulted back over the wall. The waiting horse neighed. She vaulted into the saddle, waved, and rode away. Up in the yew trees, a blackbird began to sing his evening song. The long summer stretched into autumn, and they mostly met like that, discreetly. Frank hoped that Alice's brothers would be busy and not bother them, so that he could walk with her and sit with her in the arbour on the other side. He certainly didn't want them to come to blows over his interest in Alice. But one day she came riding up to the wall on her horse when he was there, and spoke to him without dismounting. She told him sorrowfully that they were all leaving. Her father and mother and her brothers were all going on the crusade, and she was going to have to go with them. "And what will you do there?" asked Frank, dumbfounded. "I do not know. Perhaps mother and I will not go all the way, but stay in our house in Brittany. My brothers and my father will go all the way, though. He is going to have them both dubbed knights after High Mass in Dublin Castle next Sunday. They will take the cross as their coat of arms and fight the paynim as he will do." They looked at one another, grief-stricken. "Perhaps I will be back one day," she said hopelessly. "I will never forget you." "Nor I you." "Farewell then," Frank said, not half knowing what he said now. "Go with God." Again the grief-stricken look. She turned her horse and rode away. There was no further meeting. Then winter came, and left loneliness and bleakness and withering of all things that grew on both sides of the wall. Next spring and summer, Frank and the family were sitting out again in the back garden, enjoying the sunshine. But no woman came to the wall to talk. Frank was real quiet. He was inconsolable. But the wife and kids never knew why, or what it was all about. And Frank never told. He just got very melancholy. People said it was because he was just going to turn 50, and he was feeling the passage of the years. Frank Conmee was my father, and when I was a chiseller, I never knew anything about this. Though thinking back now, I do remember the wistful way he used to look over the wall when we were out in the garden. Even in the winter, I remember him doing it. He looked so alone and pale when every flower had withered from the garden and no birds sang. Only when the summer came again, he heard the song of the blackbird at the bottom of the garden, atop the yew tree, and he remembered listening to it with Alice Le Bret. She had said it was their nightingale. I was growing myself, and I had become interested in identifying birds. When I was doing homework in the evening in my room upstairs, I left the window open and heard the blackbird. But there was not just one. There were many, some near, some far, and they seemed to be echoing one another. As I grew into me teens, I would sit, me homework finished, and listen to the song, and a delicious melancholy would come over me. In that hour between daylight and darkness, anything seemed possible. I fancied when I looked out that a shadowy, graceful figure was dancing from tree to tree and bush to bush, down on the waste ground between the houses. A female figure it had to be. And I thought of a French poem I had just read at school that said, "Dans une ombre à libre ceinture, que le soir est près de saisir." It was a shadow, a shade, and the belt of her dress was loose. She was dancing, but the night, the hush and the twilight were about to take her away, and soon she would be gone. I didn't know who or what she was, but I felt like this had to be. I never heard about Alice Le Bret except from the Da. That was much later, when he was living in a nursing home in his last years. Sure, he didn't know where he was. He used to say sometimes, "I want to go home." We used to shake our heads sadly, and me sister would say, "You're not well enough to go home yet." Once or twice he tried to wander away, but they found him down in the village and brought him back. He used to tell us some queer stuff when the mood was on him to talk. Once, just once, he told me the story I've told you now. I don't know what got him going, but he told me the whole thing, as clear and coherent and poetic as you like. And this was how it started. Says he to me all of a sudden, "Son, there's people living at the bottom of the garden. I want you to know about them." I just gave a bit of a laugh. "Fairies, is it?" says I. But he looked at me awful serious, and he says, "Normans, Norman knights and ladies." "Go out with that," says I. "I'm not joking you," says he, looking at me solemnly. "They're down there still, I'm sure of it." And then he began to tell me the story. At the end he said, "So they went away, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't the last of them. Sure, they ruled in Kimmage for hundreds of years." He looked at me, and I suppose I was looking wide-eyed at him. Then says he, "If you ever meet any of them, tell them I was asking for them. And for Alice, of course. Especially for Alice. She was la belle dame, riding up to the wall on her horse, as she used to. But the way I always remember her is the first time I saw her, picking flowers." As I went out the door, I heard him singing to himself. I stopped and listened. At first I couldn't make out the words, but then I could hear, "Monsieur, par sainte charité, venez danser avec moi en Irlande." When I got out the front door of the nursing home, I didn't know what to think. I walked slowly over the grounds and then along the road to the village to get a train. It was awful quiet. There wasn't a soul around. As I turned the corner onto the road to the village, however, I saw a dog. You wouldn't notice a dog, would you? Except that he was the only living thing to be seen. His presence seemed to underline the absence of people. He looked at me, and I looked at him. He was a sleek black dog. In fact, he reminded me of the dog we used to have at home in Terenure when I was a chiseller. Then he came across the road and fell in with me. We walked all the way to the village, and he kept pace with me, padding silently along. I didn't address a word to him, but he was accompanying me, keeping me company. I hardly had the strength to walk after what I'd heard, but he was there walking with me, and every so often he'd look up, and he seemed to understand. He understood all the sorrow of the world, past, present and to come. And he didn't seem to make a big deal of it. He just trotted along beside me. When I got to the village finally, he turned and trotted away. I was able to make it through the village and onto the platform to catch the evening train into Dublin. And you know what? That was the last time I saw me father. You have been listening to People at the Bottom of the Garden by Conmee from 13 Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment. And so, until next time.